Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophets Speak. Today we continue our study of the book of Chronicles. We are in Chronicles 1, about to study chapter 8, that is Divrei Hayamim Aleph Perek Ches. And this is the second to the last chapter of straight genealogies. So unfortunately not the most exciting. However, I do strongly believe, and as I've emphasized in the last 7 chapters, that we should read through everything and try to absorb the message that the writer of the book of Chronicles is trying to convey. And with this genealogy, he is trying to convey a message to the people, specifically at the time of the rebuilding of the Jewish national presence in the land of Israel. This is the building of the Second Temple as the returnees return from the Persian, various far-flung parts of the Persian Empire. Now, this genealogy is going to focus on some of the other tribes, again, just like we had in the chapter 7, with a little tiny bit of a few biographical details here and there, and we'll discuss them when we reach them. But this is not the most exciting chapter, but again, to the people at the time, this would have been very meaningful. To those families who descended from the families whose names we're reading now, it would have been meaningful to them to place them in the arc of history. One of the most important messages of the Bible, and one of the most important messages of this book, Divrei Hayamim, is that we all always live within the arc of our history. We should not ignore our past, but see ourselves as participants in a long arc of history that includes the distant past, the recent past, the present, and the future. And if we recognize this, we will learn our lessons and build a better future. So let's not forget those lessons. Benjamin, this is verse 1. Benjamin, holid et Bela Bichoro, had a son, Bela his Bechor, his firstborn, Ashbel Hasheni, and his second Ashbel v'Achrach Hashlishi. Nocha Harvi'i, please forgive me for my cat in the background, but she's just excited about something. Bela had several children, Adar, Vigeira, Va'avihud. Those were their names. Va'avishua, V'nachman, Va'achoach, Vigeira, Ushefufan, V'churam. Those were the sons of Bela, the son of Benjamin. Ve'ela b'nei Ehud, and these following were the children of Ehud. Elahem Roshei Avos. These were the heads of the families, Liyoshvei Geva, to those who lived in Geva, Vayaglum al el Monochat, and they were exiled to Manachat. Now Manachat is in the Jerusalem region, at least we're pretty sure this is true, in the which is currently within the boundaries of the modern city of Jerusalem, known as the area of Malcha. We mentioned this before, so apparently, remember, these details would have been important. It would have placed the families that descended from them. It would have given them a sense of place in this grand project of rebuilding and resettling the land. V'naaman va'achia v'geira hu heglam. He is the how are they exiled? They were exiled by Naaman, Achia, and Geira. V'holid et Uzzah ve'et Achichud, and they had children named Uzzah and Achichud. These little biographical details are important simply because it gives you a feeling of the ongoing process, the process of fighting for the land, the process of moving from here to there to either conquer and or settle new lands, and the struggles that people and the groups had undergone in order to obtain them. This would have been very meaningful to the people listening to this at the time, and of course is very meaningful to this day. V'Shacharayim, and Shacharayim holid b'stei Moav. He had children in the fields of Moab. Min shilcho otam chushim v'et ba'ara nashav. After he had sent away his wives, Chushim and Ba'ara. This is a reference to some story of Shacharayim, a descendant of Benjamin, who went to Moab. We know of other people in those days, of course, the most famous being Elimelech, the who ended up about from the story of Ruth, also went to Moab for whatever reason. This Shacharaim did as well. We don't know the details of the story. There's, of course, various traditions related to this, but ultimately this verse isn't telling us the story. But he sent away his wives and had another wife named Vayoler min Chodesh Ishto. He married a wife named Chodesh, and she gave birth to him at Yovava, v'et Tzivya, v'et Meisha, v'et Malkam, v'et Yutz, v'et Sachya, v'et Mirma, Elev Anof Rashi Avot. These were his children. These were the heads of the families. Umechushim holidet Avituv v'es El Pa'al. And Machushim had children named Avituv and El Pa'al. Uvnei El Pa'al Ever Umisham Vashamed Hu Bana et Ono v'et Lod Uvnotzah. He built the city of Ono and Lod. Again, this is Vnotzah and its surrounding suburbs. This is important, of course, because again, it's giving us the connections between the family names and the places that they built. Again, giving the same message that we mentioned before. Uvriya v'Shema hema Rashi ha'avos, and Bria and Shema, they were the heads of the families. Liyoshvei Ayalon, to those who lived in the place called Ayalon. Hema hivrichu et Yoshvei Gat, and they chased out who were resident in the town of Gat. Not 100% clear if this is what's modern called Gat in modern Israel. If this is the same Gat as the Philistine Gat, regardless, those who lived there were conquered and by this family from the tribe of Benjamin. Achio, and Achio, his son, Shashak v'Remot. At verse 15, about to read, Uzavadia v'Arod v'Oder, more of his sons, Umichael v'Yishpa v'Yochav v'Nevriah. All of these were sons of Beriah. Uzavadia u'Meshulam v'Chizki v'Chever v'Yishmerai v'Yizliah v'Yovav b'nei El Pa'al. They were the sons of El Pa'al. V'Yakim v'Zichri v'Zabdi v'Elienai v'Tziltai v'Eliel v'Adoya u'Viraya v'Shimras b'nei Shimi. They were the descendants and the sons of Shimi. V'Yishpan v'Aver v'Eliel v'Abdon v'Zichri v'Chanan v'Chananya v'Elam v'Antosia v'Yifdiah u'Finuel b'nei Shashak. They were the children of Shashak. One of the interesting things, even though I know this sounds like a long list of names, the names actually give us a sense for how people named their children back then and the kinds of names that they had. Shashak reminds me very much of Shishak, the pharaoh. So they may have been naming some of their children after the great leaders of their generations. One of them may have, would have been the great pharaoh of Egypt, Shishak. But other names give you a relationship between the people and God. Zichri, he remembers me. Abdon is one who serves. Hanan is one who either has grace or mercy, or as a result of God's grace or mercy. So all these names mean something and give us a sense. And interestingly, archaeologically, when we find names, knowing all these names helps us understand the kinds of names that were being used in Judea, which tells us a lot about the people that lived there in past times and help identify things. So while it might seem boring, all these names actually are helpful to us to learn things. Visham Shirai Ushacharia Atalia. Atalia was a famous queen, but this Atalia here is a man, or an infamous queen for that matter. But regardless, using the same name. V'Ya'aresha v'Elia v'Zichri b'nei Yerocham. Those were sons of Yerocham. Ele Rashi Avos told us some. These were the heads of families according to their descendants. Rashim, they were the leaders. Ele Yashvu b'Yerushalayim, and these that we had just mentioned were resident in Jerusalem. So we now know that there was a contingent of Benjamin living in Jerusalem, which is well known and mentioned in other places, and certainly in rabbinic sources, this is corroborated. Uve Givon, and in a place called Givon, Yashvu Avi Givon, resided the father, meaning the leader or governor or chief of Givon. Fascinatingly, it doesn't give us his name, but it gives us his wife's name, Ma'acha. Uvno Abachar, and his firstborn was Abdon, Vitzur, Vikish, Uvaal, Vinadav. And he also had children Tzur and Kish and Baal and Nadav, Ugidor, Viachio, Vazocher. And now this Kish will be important in just a minute. We'll see why. Ugidor vi'achio v'zocher, other sons. Umiklos holid Esima, and Miklos, another descendant of Benjamin, had a child named Shim'a v'afhema neged acheim yashru b'Yerushalayim acheim, and they lived with their fellow Benjaminites in Jerusalem. V'ner holid et Kish. Ner gave birth to Kish. Forgive me, this is a different Kish than the Kish before. This is the Kish holid et Shaul, and Kish gave birth to Shaul. Now Shaul, this is Saul, this is the famous King Saul, but over here there's going to be very little talk about his kingship and his exploits and everything. There will be a brief reference to Saul later in chapter 10, which we'll get to soon, God willing. But the as we've seen with many of the great figures of the Tanakh, we just mentioned them in passing. Presumably, though, the people reading this would have known very well who Saul was and known a lot about the stories of how he ascended to the monarchy and his successes, and unfortunately, his subsequent failures. Shaul had children named Holid et Yehona's son, Viet Malkishua, Viet Avinadav, Viet Eshbaal. Now, Eshbaal, if you remember, was also known as Eshboshet. Back in when we studied together the book of Samuel, Eshboshet, it means a shame. Baal is the name of the Canaanite deity, which was a big problem in those days because many of the Jews were going after idol worship and worshiping Baal. So the fact that the King Saul had a son who was named Eshbaal after the idol was an embarrassment. So we stated before Eshboshet. Shaul in the telling of the Chronicles, Saul in the telling of the Chronicles is pretty much focuses only on his failures, none of his successes, which we see in the beginning of his career in the book of Samuel, and what made him great in the first place, and then unfortunately very flawed in the end. We discussed those in detail when we studied it together back when we studied the book of Samuel. Now, but here it doesn't mention his name Eshboshet, it mentions his name Eshbaal, presumably because it's pointing out, unfortunately, where his family went, the direction they went to, which was not necessarily good. Uven Yehona's son, the son of Yehona's son was Meriv Baal. Jonathan, right, the famous Jonathan, the close friend of David, right, he had a son, Meriv Baal, again with a name indicative of the Canaanite people and gods. Meriv Baal holid et Micha, and he had a son named Micha. Uvnei Micha, Piton, Vamelech, V'Tarea, V'Achaz. V'Achaz holid et Yehoada. Achaz had a child named Yehoada. V'Yehoada holid et Olemet, V'et Azmovet, V'et Zimri, V'Zimri holid et Motza. Zimri had a child named Motza. Motza holid et Bina, and Rapha Beno, and his son was Rapha. El Asa Beno, his son was El Asa. Atzel Beno, his son was Atzel. Ula Atzel Shisha Banim, and Atzel had 6 sons. Ve'ele Shemosam, and these were their names: Azrikam, Bochruvi, Yishmael, Usha Arya, Ve'ovadia, Ve'chanan, Kol Ele, B'nei Atzal. These were all the children of Atzal. Uvenei Eshek, and the sons of Eshek, Achiv, his brother. Sons of Eshek, his brother, was Ulam Bechoro, his firstborn Ulam, Yush Hasheni, the second one Yush, Ve'elishaphat Hashlishi. Vayuvnei Ulam Anashim Giborei Chayil, they were mighty men, warriors, the children of Ulam. Dorchei Keshet, those that drew a bow. They were archers. Umarbim Banim, and they had many children. Uvnei Banim, and grandchildren. Me'av Hamishim, 150 descendants. Kol Eila Mibnei Binyamin, these were all from the children of Binyamin. Now, this concludes chapter 8. As we know, not super exciting. But if you were a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin and you knew your you would have looked back and said, yes, I come from there. They were Gibori Chayil, they were mighty, they conquered and settled these areas, and this is my heritage, this is where I'm from. This would have been very meaningful to you, even if it's not necessarily meaningful to me and you today. But it is even today, because we look back, we see, where do I come from? Where does my family come from? Where do my grandparents, my great-grandparents, where did their great-grandparents come from? The travails of the Jewish people over generations and centuries and millennia is something we look back to, we're proud of, and we find our place in, and it gives us a place and meaning to what we're doing today. We're continuing this legacy, and we're building a legacy for the future. Thank you so much for studying chapter 8 of the book of Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles, together. Looking forward to studying chapter 9, and of course the rest of this beautiful book of Chronicles together. Have a wonderful day.